Garrett Jensen had a bad feeling about the way things were running at his car wash chain. And this morning, that feeling was about to be confirmed. For months, customer complaints had been increasing dirty cars leaving the wash, long wait times, and employees looking exhausted whenever he visited a location. His district manager, Rodney, assured him everything was fine. Just growing pains, Rodney had said, but Garrett wasn't convinced. His father had built this company from the ground up before passing it down to him, and Garrett wasn't about to let it crumble under bad management. So, he made a decision. He would go undercover, working as a janitor at one of his busiest locations. Disguising himself wasn't hard. He shaved his beard, dyed his brown hair black, and wore glasses. None of the employees had ever met him personally. He had inherited the chain and mostly worked from corporate. To them, he was just another new hire. Garrett arrived at the car wash early, stepping into the back entrance where the employees clocked in. The air smelled of soap and wet pavement. A group of workers huddled near the employee break room, some yawning, others rubbing their eyes. "Hey, you must be the new guy." A tall, middle-aged man with a shaved head and a beer belly stepped forward. His name tag read Frank Supervisor. "Yeah," Garrett said, adjusting his glasses. "Name's Gary." Frank grunted. "Janitorial, huh? Well, don't get in my way and clean whatever I tell you to. Got it." Garrett nodded, already noticing how the employees stiffened when Frank spoke. The shift started rough. The car wash was packed with customers, and the employees were scrambling. Garrett grabbed a mop and started cleaning the floors near the vacuum station when he overheard two workers talking in hushed voices. "I swear, if I have to work another double shift, I'm gonna pass out," one of them, a young man named Lewis, said. "No way Frank's gonna let us leave early," a woman named Tanya replied. "He doesn't care if we drop." Garrett frowned, double shifts back to back. He was going to get to the bottom of this. By mid-morning, he had already seen enough to be concerned. Employees were overworked, some barely keeping up with the rush. Frank, however, didn't lift a finger. He stood near the register, barking orders, and his treatment of the janitorial staff Garrett included was worse. "Hey, Gary," Frank called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Why don't you go clean the bathrooms? And don't take all day, or I'll dock your pay." Garrett gritted his teeth and grabbed the cleaning supplies. As he entered the restroom, he nearly gagged. It looked like it hadn't been cleaned in days. As he scrubbed the sinks, he heard a small voice behind him. "Hey, man, you knew." Garrett turned to see an elderly janitor, maybe in his late 60s, wearing a uniform that looked too big for him. His name tag read Walter. "Yeah," Garrett said, standing up. "First day." Walter gave him a tired smile. "Well, welcome to the worst job here." Garrett chuckled, but then he noticed Walter's hands red and cracked, like he had been scrubbing floors for hours. "How long have you been here today?" Garrett asked. Walter sighed. "Since 5 this morning. Frank wouldn't let me leave last night until after 11. Garrett's jaw tightened. That was 16 hours. Before he could say anything else, the bathroom door swung open. Frank stormed in. "Walter, what the hell are you doing? You're supposed to be cleaning the customer area, not chatting with the new guy." Walter flinched. "I was just." "Shut up and move," Frank snapped. "And Gary, if I catch you slacking, you're out of here." Garrett stood frozen as Walter hurried past him, shoulders hunched. His fists clenched. He had seen enough. By the end of the shift, Garrett watched as exhausted employees dragged their feet to clock out. Walter, however, was not leaving. Frank had stopped him at the door. "You ain't done yet," Frank said, blocking Walter's path. "Mop the entrance again. It's streaky." Walter looked like he was about to collapse. "Frank, please, I do it." Garrett couldn't stay silent anymore. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'll do it." Frank turned to him, narrowing his eyes. What? I'll mop the entrance. Walter's been here since 5 in the morning. Let him go home. Frank scoffed. Who do you think you are, huh? This is how things work here. You don't like it, you can leave. Garrett stared at him, his heart pounding. He wanted to scream at him to fire him on the spot, but not yet. He needed to see how deep this went. So he picked up the mop and started cleaning, watching as Walter gave him a grateful nod before shuffling out the door. Garrett knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Garrett left the car wash that night with his mind racing. What he had seen in just one shift was already worse than he had expected. Employees pushed to their limits, a supervisor who ruled through intimidation, and a veteran worker being forced to stay well past a reasonable shift. If this was just the surface, what else was happening behind closed doors? He arrived early the next morning, blending in again with the other employees as they shuffled in, some moving stiffly from the long hours of the previous day. Garrett noticed Lewis rubbing his temples as he poured himself a cup of burnt-smelling coffee from the break room machine. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted the cup. Tanya, standing beside him, nudged him gently, asking if he was okay. Lewis just nodded, but Garrett could see the exhaustion in his face. As the shift began, Garrett positioned himself near the drying station, watching how things operated. The machines did most of the washing, but the employees had to do the finishing touches, wiping down windows, drying mirrors, making sure no water spots remained. It should have been a simple process, but it was clear that the team was stretched too thin. A customer in a silver sedan pulled up to the vacuum station, waving down an employee. The worker, a teenage boy named Kyle, rushed over. The woman gestured toward her car, her voice rising in irritation. Kyle nodded quickly and ran toward the supply rack to grab a cleaning cloth. Before he could reach it, Frank intercepted him. "What are you doing?" Frank's voice was sharp. Kyle flinched. Customer asked for a wipe down inside the door panel. Frank crossed his arms. "We don't do that unless they pay extra. Tell her she should have read the sign." Kyle hesitated, but it's just a quick. Frank cut him off. He said, "No, you got time to do extra work, you got time to clean the floor. Go grab a broom." Kyle's face turned red as he swallowed whatever response he wanted to give. He turned back toward the woman's car, clearly dreading the conversation. Garrett could already see how this was going to play out. Sure enough, within minutes, the woman was at the front counter, demanding to speak to a manager. Frank strolled over, putting on an exaggeratedly polite expression. Garrett listened carefully as he spoke to the customer, his tone dripping with fake concern. "Ma'am, I completely understand your frustration, but we have clear policies. If you'd like the interior detailed, there's an additional charge." The woman huffed. "It's not about the money, it's about the attitude. That kid looked terrified to even ask for permission. It's like he thought he'd be punished for helping me. What kind of place are you running here?" Frank's smile barely held. "Assure you, we treat all our employees fairly." Garrett clenched his jaw. That was an outright lie. The woman scoffed, shaking her head as she walked out, muttering about never coming back. As soon as she was gone, Frank turned back to Kyle, his expression darkening. "See what you did? Now we got a bad review incoming, all because you couldn't follow basic rules." Kyle looked down, clearly trying to stay quiet. Frank sneered. "Next time, keep your mouth shut and do what you're told." Garrett had to force himself to stay in character. If he revealed himself now, he wouldn't get the full picture. He needed more. Later in the afternoon, he found himself scrubbing down equipment near the supply room when he heard hushed voices inside. He stopped, not stepping in just yet. "I can't keep doing this, man." Lewis' voice was low but tense. "I got school and Frank keeps doubling my shifts. I'm barely sleeping." Tanya sighed. "He does that to everyone. You think I wanted to be here 12 hours yesterday? He doesn't care what we have going on outside of work." Lewis groaned. I tried talking to Rodney about it, but he just brushed it off. Said Frank knows what he's doing. Garrett's stomach turned. So Rodney, his district manager, was ignoring complaints. That meant this problem wasn't just at this location, it was a systemic failure in management. He had heard enough. He stepped into the room, keeping his voice casual. Hey, what's left on the cleaning list? Tanya and Lewis straightened, clearly not expecting him. Tanya glanced at the clipboard on the wall. Just the back lot. You want a trade? I'll take your section. Garrett nodded, grabbing a broom. As he walked outside, he spotted Walter leaning against the back wall, massaging his hands. Garrett approached him. You all right? Walter gave a tired chuckle. Been worse, been better. Garrett hesitated before asking, how long you been working here? Walter exhaled slowly. Too long, almost 10 years. Garrett frowned. And Frank's been treating you like this the whole time. Walter shook his head. Nah, he wasn't always like this. He got promoted a few years back and something changed, started acting like he owned the place. That lined up with what Garrett suspected. Power had gone to Frank's head, and with Rodney turning a blind eye, he had free rein to do whatever he wanted. Walter gave him a sideways glance. You ask a lot of questions for a janitor. Garrett forced a small grin, just trying to understand the job. Walter hummed, not entirely convinced but too tired to question it further. At that moment, Frank's voice bellowed from inside. Walter, where the hell are you? Walter let out a slow breath, pushing himself off the wall. Garrett watched him disappear back inside, his steps heavy. Garrett's hands curled into fists. He had seen enough. Tomorrow, everything would change. Garrett arrived just before sunrise, the parking lot still empty. He sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, running through everything he had seen. The way Frank bullied the employees, the exhaustion on Lewis' face, and the way Walter's hands shook from overwork. Rodney, the district manager, had ignored every complaint. That meant the culture of neglect wasn't just at this location, it was systemic. He had all the proof he needed. It was time for the truth to come out. Inside, the early shift workers were already gathering. Tanya leaned against the supply counter, rubbing her temples. Lewis sat on an upside-down bucket, staring at the floor, his uniform wrinkled from what looked like another sleepless night. Walter moved slowly, stretching his back. Garrett scanned the room. Frank wasn't in yet. Good, he turned to the workers. They barely acknowledged his presence at first, until he spoke, his voice firm but calm. He told them who he really was. At first there was silence. Then Tanya let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Lewis blinked at him, as if trying to process the words. Walter, standing in the corner, straightened slightly. Garrett continued, explaining that he had gone undercover to see things for himself, because the reports he had been getting didn't match what he was seeing now. He told them he had seen the mistreatment firsthand, the exhaustion, the impossible hours. Lewis let out a sharp breath and ran a hand through his hair. Tanya shook her head, muttering something under her breath. Walter exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Then Tanya spoke, her voice edged with frustration. She asked if this meant anything was actually going to change, or if this was just another corporate stunt. Garrett assured her this was real, that things were going to be different. Before anyone could say more, the back door swung open. Frank entered, yawning, rubbing the back of his neck. He barely glanced at them as he walked to the time clock. Then he stopped, noticing the way everyone was looking at Garrett. His eyes narrowed. Garrett turned to face him fully. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply stated the truth. He told Frank who he really was and why he had come undercover. Frank's face shifted instantly. First confusion, then realization, then something colder. He tried to wave it off at first, saying Garrett had only seen a bad couple of days. He claimed the employees exaggerated things, that they were just lazy, and that the business needed discipline to run properly. Garrett didn't let him finish. He laid out everything he had seen. He spoke about the forced overtime, the intimidation, the way Frank had treated Walter as if he were disposable. He repeated the way Frank had humiliated Kyle in front of a customer, the way he had ignored the workers' exhaustion, and how he had dismissed customer service entirely in favor of squeezing more labor out of his team. Frank's face darkened, and he tried to shift the blame. He insisted Rodney had signed off on all of it, that he was just following directions. Garrett wasn't interested in excuses. He told Frank, in no uncertain terms, that his time here was over. The room was silent. Frank's expression twisted, his jaw tightening. Then, without another word, he ripped off his name tag, tossed it onto the counter, and stormed out the back door. The tension lingered even after he was gone. Garrett turned back to the employees. He knew firing Frank wasn't enough. Removing one bad manager wouldn't fix everything overnight. He needed to make real, lasting changes. He told them Rodney would be dealt with next. He promised they would never be forced into those abusive work conditions again. Pay would be reviewed. Scheduling would be fixed. And most importantly, this location and the entire company would be rebuilt with the workers in mind. Walter crossed his arms, studying Garrett carefully. Then, after a long moment, he gave a small nod. Tanya looked down, exhaling, as if she had been holding her breath for months. Louis rubbed his face, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Garrett knew words weren't enough. Action was what mattered. And action was exactly what was coming next. After Frank walked out, the air inside the car wash felt dense, like the weight of his presence still lingered. The employees exchanged uncertain glances, as if waiting for something else to happen. Garrett knew that firing one bad manager wouldn't erase the exhaustion they had endured. Trust wasn't built in a single moment, it had to be earned. He looked at the team, their faces still wary. Louis shifted his feet, rubbing the back of his neck, while Tanya folded her arms tightly across her chest. Walter remained still, his gaze locked on Garrett, studying him the same way someone might examine a broken machine, unsure if it could be repaired. Garrett stepped forward, keeping his voice steady. He acknowledged that what had happened wasn't just a Frank problem. Leadership had failed them at every level. He admitted that Rodney had ignored their complaints, that policies had allowed overwork to become the norm, and that none of them should have had to suffer in silence. Tanya let out a slow breath, her posture easing slightly. Louis gave a small nod, though his expression remained guarded. Walter simply listened, his face unreadable. Garrett didn't expect gratitude. He expected skepticism. He needed to prove that this wasn't just another corporate speech. He told them they would be going home early today with full pay. Schedules would be reworked immediately to ensure fair hours. Overtime would be optional, not forced. And effective immediately, janitorial staff would receive a raise. A flicker of surprise crossed Walter's face, but he didn't say anything. Tanya's brow furrowed like she wanted to ask if this was real. Louis glanced at the others before exhaling, as if he didn't fully believe it yet. Garrett knew words wouldn't be enough. He needed to act. He stepped outside and made a call to Rodney. When the district manager answered, his tone was casual, unaware of what had just unfolded. Garrett didn't waste time. He laid out everything he had seen, from the forced overtime to the ignored complaints. Rodney tried to deflect, saying Frank had been handling things, that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Garrett cut him off. He had seen it with his own eyes. This wasn't incompetence, this was neglect. Rodney stammered, trying to salvage his position. Garrett wasn't interested. He told Rodney his services were no longer needed. By the time he walked back inside, the employees were gathering near the front counter, whispering among themselves. When he re-entered the room, they fell silent, waiting. Garrett told them Rodney was gone. Effective immediately, there would be a new district manager, someone who understood what leadership actually meant. He promised that hiring decisions wouldn't be made from a desk. A new manager would be chosen based on their ability to support the team, not just enforce policies. Tanya leaned against the counter, tapping her fingers against the surface. Louis crossed his arms, watching Garrett carefully. Walter sat down in one of the break room chairs, rubbing his hands together. Then Walter spoke, his voice calm but firm. He said that promises were easy to make but harder to keep. He had seen people come and go, each one claiming things would change, only for nothing to improve. Garrett nodded. He told Walter he understood. That was why he wasn't leaving yet. For the next week, Garrett stayed at the car wash, working alongside them. He cleaned the floors, manned the drying station, and handled customer interactions. He learned which machines constantly malfunctioned, which processes wasted time, and which employees had been picking up the slack without recognition. He saw how Tanya often coached new hires, stepping in when they struggled. He noticed how Louis, despite being exhausted, was one of the fastest workers when given a reasonable workload. He watched Walter keep everything running with quiet efficiency, despite the years of strain on his body. Each night, Garrett held meetings, asking the employees what needed to change. He listened, he took notes, and then he made those changes happen. By the end of the week, something shifted. Tanya's posture was looser, her usual skepticism replaced with cautious optimism. Louis no longer looked like he was dragging himself through the day. Walter, while still reserved, seemed to regard Garrett with something close to approval. One afternoon, as Garrett finished restocking the supply closet, Walter approached him. He didn't say much at first, just stood there, as if debating whether to speak. Then, after a moment, he told Garrett that he had never seen an owner work the floor like this. Garrett shrugged, saying he should have done it sooner. Walter gave a small nod, then walked off to finish his shift. That was all Garrett needed to know. The car wash wasn't fixed overnight, but the culture had changed, and this time it was going to last. Garrett wasn't done. Removing Frank and Rodney had been necessary, but it didn't solve everything. It was just the beginning. If he walked away now, the changes would be temporary. He needed to make sure the foundation of his father's company was rebuilt the right way with the people doing the work at the center. The first step was hiring a new district manager. Garrett didn't trust an outside hire. He had learned the hard way that bringing in someone disconnected from the daily grind led to problems. He needed someone who understood the reality of the job, someone who wouldn't just enforce policies, but actually support the employees. After reviewing the team, he made his choice: Tanya. She was shocked when he pulled her aside to offer the position. At first, she thought he was joking. When she realized he was serious, she hesitated. She admitted she had never thought about management before. She wasn't sure if she wanted the responsibility. Garrett told her she had already been leading. She was the one employees turned to when things got chaotic. She was the one covering for mistakes, training new hires, and keeping morale from sinking completely. The only difference now was that she'd have the power to make real changes. Tanya thought about it for a long moment, then asked if she would have control over hiring and scheduling. Garrett told her she would. That sealed it. She took the job. With Tanya stepping up, the next step was fixing the workload. Garrett had already adjusted the scheduling to remove forced overtime, but he quickly realized that wasn't enough. The problem wasn't just hours, it was understaffing. Frank had deliberately kept the crew short to save money, forcing employees to work harder with fewer hands. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Garrett approved immediate hiring, not just for this location, but across the company. More employees meant fewer double shifts, shorter wait times for customers, and less burnout. It was an investment, but he knew it would pay off. As new hires started trickling in, the difference was noticeable. Louis, who had been running on fumes, finally had enough coverage to focus on his job without feeling like he was drowning. Walter, who had been carrying more than his fair share of janitorial work, finally had help. Even the newer employees, who were once overwhelmed, were starting to settle into a rhythm. One afternoon, Garrett watched as Lewis trained a new employee on the drying station. His voice had energy again, something that had been missing before. Walter moved slower than the younger workers, but he no longer looked like he was dragging himself through the day. With staffing stabilized, Garrett turned his focus to customer experience. Frank's approach had been about squeezing every dollar from customers, often at the cost of service. That had to change. Garrett introduced a new policy. Employees had the authority to offer small, complimentary services if it improved customer satisfaction. If a car came out with streaks, employees could do a quick wipe down free of charge. If a loyal customer had a complaint, employees could handle it without needing approval from a manager. At first, the team was hesitant. They had been conditioned to expect backlash for doing anything outside the rigid system Frank had enforced. But when Garrett reassured them that they wouldn't be punished for doing the right thing, they started to embrace it. One day, a woman pulled up to the vacuum station, struggling to get her toddler out of the backseat while juggling a diaper bag. Tanya walked over and offered to help. It was a small thing, but the woman's relief was obvious. Moments like that were what Garrett wanted to foster. A business wasn't just about transactions, it was about people. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Customers started leaving better reviews. Employees showed up to work without the weight of exhaustion dragging them down. The energy in the place shifted. Garrett knew the real test would be time. A single good month didn't mean the problems were permanently solved. So, he made a final decision. He wasn't going back to managing the company from a distance. Instead of relying on second-hand reports, he would visit locations regularly, not as the CEO, but as someone working the floor. He wouldn't announce his visits. He wouldn't come in as an executive in a suit. He would work shifts, talk to employees directly, and see things for himself. It wasn't about catching mistakes. It was about staying connected. A few weeks later, he returned to the car wash, this time without the disguise. Employees greeted him with nods, some more comfortable with his presence than before. Lewis gave a quick wave before focusing back on a car. Walter, wiping down equipment, acknowledged him with a small grunt. Tanya, now in her new manager role, was reviewing schedules at the counter. She looked up when Garrett approached and asked if he was here to inspect the troops. Garrett shook his head. He was here to work. Tanya smirked and tossed him a towel. There was a line of cars waiting to be dried. Garrett grabbed the towel and got to work.